Welcome to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Me podcast, a podcast designed to help you increase your influence, develop your leadership, and maximize your results. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode on Keystone Habits in the Spiritual Dimension of Life. This is the fourth in a series of 5 episodes I'm doing on Keystone Habits. So if you haven't listened to the previous few episodes, you want to go back and maybe start at the beginning of this little mini series where I'm really talking about what is a keystone habit to begin with and why is it important. And then once you understand what it is and why it's important, how can we create some of those keystone habits in our lives? And what are the specific keystone habits, the foundational habits that help us get more leverage in other areas of our life? So last couple of episodes, we've talked about keystone habits in the physical dimension, as well as the mental and emotional dimension. And today's podcast episode is all about the keystone habits of the spiritual dimension. So, the reason I think that, and I don't think that they are necessarily in a specific order. I think that each of us are probably naturally drawn to or stronger in one dimension of life. And what I mean by that is most of us probably naturally gravitate toward one dimension of life where we just seem to have more of it together in that dimension of life than a different dimension of life. So for example, that I think that that's either physical or mental dimension for me. And it would be interesting to really reflect on which, but if I had to pick just off the spur of the moment, I would say physical dimension for me is probably just naturally where I tend to be stronger. And it's just the way I'm wired, right? I tend to just naturally gravitate toward automatically creating good, healthier choice, not perfect certainly, but healthier choices in the physical dimension of life just by nature of who I am. And I think that's why I experienced so much growth in my life when I really became intentional about creating great physical habits in the physical dimension of life, exercise particularly. So, but you might not be wired toward the physical dimension as your natural strength. It just happens to be one of my stronger areas, maybe the mental dimension. But if I just had to pick one right off the cuff without reflecting on it, I would probably say that the physical one is just where I tend to naturally gravitate. And just that's the dimension of life that it was easier for me to, you know, really bring into balance and harmony and to be intentional in that dimension of my life and that space of my life. It just comes more naturally to me, it seems like. There again, we're all wired a little differently, I think, but I really feel like that's just my natural area. I tend to just be naturally interested. If I'm just reading for fun, for example, or listening to a podcast just to, something that I enjoy, maybe I'll learn from, but something that I'll enjoy, it's amazing how much of the time I'm turning toward books on nutrition and wellness or healthy exercise or running or something like that. And that's what I'm, not even necessarily trying to be intentional about learning something from that book, but just, hey, this is interesting to me. I want to read about it. I just enjoy reading about things like that. So I think that I don't think there's one dimension of life that we all automatically start to grow in. But I think that for each of us, we have kind of a natural area again where we're just naturally, we pull a little more naturally toward one dimension of life where we just seem to have a little more altogether. Now, that doesn't mean we're not weaker in another area of life. In fact, that's often the case. If we're if we're naturally strong in one dimension of life, we have to be careful that we're not neglecting another area of life, because life is interconnected. The dimensions of life are interconnected because we as a human being are interconnected with all dimensions of our life, and we carry our whole self with us everywhere we go. We can't help that, right? We carry all of us everywhere we go. And it's almost a cliche that you've heard about the very successful executive whose health is suffering because they're not paying attention to the health dimension of life. So that's someone who maybe just was naturally, successful and gravitated toward the social dimension. Their career's going great. They're executive in a good, a great career path or a good company, but they're neglecting the physical dimension of life. And so just a word of caution there, whether you know what your natural tendency is or not, just be careful to look back at all areas of life from time to time and make sure that you are not neglecting one area, that you are looking for some balance and harmony. Now, that's going to look a little different from all of us. And let me tell you, that will change in the seasons of life. The example of a new mom with a brand new baby is not getting a whole lot of sleep, right? And so physically, she's a little tired, she's a little drained, but she's a little out of balance, but she's in harmony, right, with the season of her life, the time of her life, and that's okay. We can get a little bit out of balance from time to time. We just need to be intentional that we are bringing that sense of balance back and kind of restoring it a little bit. Because if we neglect one dimension of life for too long, we'll find that starts to suffer long term, and then it affects the other dimensions of life, right? If our health is poor, sooner or later we're going to pay a toll in the other areas of life. So when we think about the spiritual dimension of life, and last podcast episode I really talked about making sure we're developing our character, right? And that can happen in a lot of different ways. We see kids who play on high school sports and athletics. We see that really helps them build character a lot of times, right? And it might not be sports, but that's just an example of, at some point we realize that children who grow up being involved in athletics or something like that, that's physical dimension, but it helps them develop the character that they can carry on and hopefully into their adult life. It helps them create some good habits, right? Some keystone habits, if you will. And that's certainly not the only way to develop character, but just one example of a physical activity that can help us grow character. And then, I talked a little bit last podcast episode too about the mental and emotional dimension and how we develop our character by growing and reading specifically, or absorbing new information and new insights, new wisdom. But here's the thing. Just absorbing all of the knowledge in the world isn't going to help you if you don't apply it. And I think that's why today's podcast episode is a really good sequel to last week's podcast episode, because today I'm talking about the spiritual dimension of life. And I don't really mean religion. When I say spiritual dimension of life, that it could be your religion. And religion certainly is derived from our spiritual life. But religion is the how we practice, the how we carry out the results of our spiritual life, right? Whatever our spiritual journey, a faith-based journey, would absolutely result in, having a religious practice. But when I say spiritual life, it's bigger than just going to church on Sunday morning. When I say spiritual life, I think spiritual life is really where our values are kept, our heart dimension, if you will. And by that, I mean, what's really important to you and your journey and your heart space. Every single one of us have, our different values. A lot of us have the same values, but nobody can tell you what your values should be. And hopefully you spent some time thinking about your values and intentionally choosing them. But that comes from that spiritual dimension, right? Where we intentionally sit down and think, what is most important to me? And how is that going to live out in my life? There again, the example of faith comes to mind. If faith is an important value to me, then how is that going to reflect in my life? Is that sitting down to pray before every meal? Is that going to church every week? Is that, ministering to people? Is that cooking food for sick people, right? There's lots of different ways that our faith journey could be manifested in the work of our hands. And that's just one example of one value. If your value and your spiritual dimension is health and wellness, then that's going to manifest in the physical dimension of life. So you start to see, as I talk through all of these different keystone habits, that life is truly interconnected. But a lot of us don't spend the time. I know I didn't. I probably, I probably was mid 30s, early 30s, maybe, when I sat down and thought, what are my values? Like, what's really most important to me? Now, here's the thing. Most of us know what's important to us. It doesn't necessarily match what we would say is important, but I'll tell you, you can always figure out what is important to somebody by their checkbook, their calendar, and their conversation, right? What they're spending money on, what they're spending time doing, and what they talk about. Checkbook, calendar, and conversation. That will tell you all you need to know about what's important to someone. It's just going to naturally reflect from their values. But there again, a lot of people don't just automatically sit down one day and go, I should list out my top few values, right? We just don't think about that. We're not really taught that concept. So if you haven't thought about that, that is where the spiritual dimension rests, is inherent in our values and what's most important to us. If family is one of your values in your heart space, and that is just part of who you are, then family is so important to you. Maybe it's one of your top values. Then that's going to look like making sure that you always have time with family. You're calling family members, you're intentionally setting dates to have lunch with your family members, or family gatherings. Your house is always where Christmas is held, right? That might be an example of how family is manifested as important in your life. So when we think about a keystone habit in the spiritual dimension, I don't know of a better way to say it. It's not really it's not really a sleek sentence, but I think that the spiritual dimension of life comes down to thought or thinking, intentional thinking, right? Because we talked about just having knowledge doesn't help. It's the application of knowledge that helps us change, improve, and grow. But I think that until we intentionally think about and reflect on our values and our spiritual dimension of life, and where our values are centered and where we're getting those values from, because if nobody else can tell you what your values are, you've got to decide what they are, but only you can decide what they are. But I think that the spiritual dimension of life keystone habit is intentional thinking. When I read a great book, or I read a great quote, I spend some time intentionally thinking on how this applies to my life. What can I do with this piece of wisdom? Right? If I just read it, I've just recognized it has some insight and some value, but until I do something with it, it's not very valuable to me. So I really have to be intentional about, okay, sit down and think about, how do I apply this to my life? If you are a person who likes to journal, this is a great keystone habit, or a great example of how intentional thinking can be manifested in your spiritual dimension. And that's one reason I have my motivational planning journal series, because at some point I realized that intentionally thinking in the first few minutes of my day really helped the rest of my day be successful and run smoothly. And I was accomplishing what was most important to me. But that all started with intentionally thinking, what are my priorities for the day? So, I've kind of followed this basic outline for a long time, years, and I would look for a tool that would help me follow out. It's a very simple, 5-10 minutes, probably not even that. It's 5 minutes. Just a framework that would help me intentionally think into my day, motivationally plan my day, if you will, based on my priorities. And I couldn't find a tool. And so I created one. And, you see, this is my current, there are 6 motivational planning journals in the series. And this is the one I'm currently working in. And all of the pages have the same basic framework, but the quotes change every single day. And so there's a different theme for each one of the journals. There is one on, like, this journal that I'm using, this motivational planning journal that I'm using right now. It's got 60 days worth of pages in it. And the theme for this one is make today extraordinarily amazing. So all of the quotes are really centered around just making the most of today, right? Getting the joy out of today. I heard a phrase the other day on a movie Mac and I were watching, and it was an older gentleman. And he was recounting a story from his life. And he said to someone, he said, I've had a good life. He said, I've had a big life. And I thought, wow, that's pretty awesome. How awesome is it to say, I've had a big life? So I just love that phrase. But that's kind of the theme for this journal that I've been currently working from. There's a theme of resilience, which is, again, one of my favorites, although the quotes really speak to rising again after adversity. So anyway, just 6 different themes, 6 different ways that the motivational planning journal can help you throughout your month or your year. And if that concept interests you, I did a whole podcast on my actual 5-minute motivational planning routine. So you don't have to buy the journals. You can go back and listen to the podcast. But if you are interested in journals, you can find all of those available on Amazon, or of course, they're on my website, riastory.com, and look for the motivational planning journals. You can find that. You can even order all of them online right there if that interests you. But there again, you can carry out the practice in your life. What I basically walk you through is just a couple minutes of intentionally thinking in every dimension of your life. So there's a space for, what is one thing I'm going to do today to be healthier, right? That's the physical dimension of life. But there again, this is just an example of my 5-minute morning routine that helps me intentionally think about my priorities, my values. And this is in the spiritual dimension of life. The spirit is, the spiritual dimension of our life in terms of who we are as a person. And absolutely, that could be, faith is a big part of that, and you're in your own spiritual walk. But when I say spiritual dimension, what I'm really saying is that heart dimension where our values reside. And absolutely, faith can be a big part of that. So just think about that. Is there a specific time of the day that naturally lends itself in your day to intentionally thinking? This could be journaling, this could be reflection, this could be using one of my motivational planning journals, but just, are you intentionally thinking? Do you have time and space in your world, in your morning, in your week, where you are intentionally thinking and planning, looking forward, reflecting on things you've learned, things that you wish you hadn't have done, maybe not mistakes, but reflecting on what you could have done differently, what you could do differently next time to get a better outcome, right? Just intentionally thinking about the different areas of life and leveraging that thought, that intentional thinking. And, I heard John Maxwell speak one time, and he was talking about the power of, being intentional and thinking. I think he has a book, Thinking for a Change. And I heard him talk a little bit about this one time, and I got such a kick out of it because he says, I mean, he's a big proponent of intentional thinking, obviously. And he says, he was recounting the story. He said, you know what? Some people ask me, how do I think? And he's like, oh, I've got this thinking chair. He's like, but I don't just go down in the chair and sit and wait for thoughts and profound moments of insight to come find me. He said, when I go to a place to think, whether that's, swimming or in my thinking chair or in my desk, at my desk in my office privately, he says, I have something that I'm intentionally thinking about. I don't just wait for great moments of insight to come find me. He said, because that's not going to happen. He said, I have something, a problem, a thought, an idea for a new book, whatever it might be. He said, and wherever I go to that thinking place, I already have something that I'm like, oh, I need to think about this. So let me intentionally direct the most powerful organ in my body toward this problem or idea. Because our brain absolutely is the most powerful organ in the body, right? Because it directs everything else. And I would venture to say that most of us are not even close to tapping into our capacity and our potential of thinking and intentionally leveraging powerful thought. And there again, it's just, intentional thought is a discipline. There is no doubt. It's just as much of a discipline as sitting down and reading something every day or exercising every day or eating healthy, because our brains just, aren't necessarily used to being disciplined like that. And you could probably validate this. Have you ever sat down to pray? And, it kind of goes something like this. You say, Lord, thank you for this. Thank you for this. And in a moment, you're thinking about your grocery list for tomorrow. And you're like, oh, I really sat down to pray and to come to God with thought. And then suddenly this grocery list just kind of snuck into your brain, right? Maybe it's not prayer for you. Maybe it's meditation. If you've ever tried to sit down and meditate and just clear your head of thoughts, you will find that it's incredibly difficult to do. And you have to develop the discipline to push random thoughts away and focus on whatever it is you're focusing on, whether that's not thinking at all or thinking on purpose. And for me, it's interesting because if I'm running, especially by myself, or even just walking, this is a great time for me to think, because I really have, my body's doing something, and that's a great way for me to just put my body on autopilot, and then my brain can get engaged. But it's incredibly hard to think about one specific thing. And it's almost like I cannot do it while I'm running or walking. If I really need to intentionally think about something really powerfully, I need to stop doing something with my body so that I can leverage the full power of discipline in my mind. And I don't know if everyone is like that. I just find that if I'm just out for a walk or a run, I get all kind of great ideas and great thoughts. They just kind of pop in. It's a great creative time for me. I feel good, blood is flowing, energy's good. But if I really need to intentionally think on purpose about one specific thing, most of the time that doesn't happen when I'm running or walking. I need to just sit down and be intentional about it. The second best place for me on really dedicated thinking is driving. And I don't know why, but driving for me is just really good, dedicated, focused thinking time, right? Moments of insight, reflection, wisdom. What do I need to do with this, right? If I just have something that I need to chew on, driving for me can be just a great way to tap into that intentional thought time. So whatever that is for you, whether it's driving, whether it's the shower, whether it's running, or maybe it's, first thing in the morning, you close your door, spend some time with your motivational planning journal or your intentional morning routine and thinking about each dimension of life. How this is that keystone habit, right? If you get this down, it makes all of the rest of your day go so much better, because we're really talking about leveraging the power of being intentional, right? Intentional thought is going to lead to intentional actions, which is going to lead to improved results, improved circumstances, and more influence. So I cannot say enough about this spiritual dimension. This keystone habit is intentional thinking. And if you need a tool to guide you in this, check out my journals, ritastory.com/journals. There's a couple of resources there that you can go through, or go back and listen to the podcast where I walk you through my morning routine. But maybe you have your own and you've just lost touch with it. Maybe you used to be really good about that intentional reflection time in the morning, and you want to get back to it. So just make sure that you are leveraging the power of this keystone habit. And if you're not a morning person and nighttime just absolutely is the deal breaker for you, then go for it, right? Figure out how this works for you best in your life and then make it work. Because if you are not spending even a few minutes a day, a few minutes a week, intentionally thinking about how to move forward in life, you are missing out on the brain, the mind, one of the greatest asset that you have in your body. So until next time.